and welcome to episode 6 of Faith versus Faith, the show in which I compare and contrast Jehovah's Witnesses with other high control groups. Today, I'll be chatting with Ashley Easter, a former member of the Quiverfull Movement. Ashley is a writer, TV producer, ordained reverend, and advocate for victims of abuse. In addition to being the founder of the Courage Conference, Ashley is author of the book, The Courage Coach, a practical, friendly guide on how to heal from abuse. Ashley, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this chat today.
So I'm at a huge disadvantage when it comes to the Quiverfull Movement, the Patriarchy Movement, which I understand is somehow related, and indeed the Independent Fundamentalist Baptist movement. So I'm hoping I can learn more from our conversation. But it's fair to say that you have had a very difficult time with your upbringing in that movement. Perhaps you can just take us through your earliest recollections.
Sure, absolutely. So to give you just a little bit of context, there's some words that aren't necessarily mainstream understood. So I'll kind of give you some background there. So I grew up in the Christian faith, and I do still identify as Christian, though much more progressive than I once was. But both of my grandfathers were pastors in independent fundamentalist Baptist churches. So in my early days, those churches only read out of the King James Bible. Some people only wore skirts, not my family in particular. They used to do that and then kind of got over that a little bit. But just a very strict legalistic view of scripture in that church. And like I said, both my grandfathers were pastors in this denomination. So, I was there in church from the time I was a few days old until I left at about 21. So you have this IFB church movement, which if you have read any of the headlines recently, there's been a lot of abuse scandals, sexual abuse scandals that have come out about that recently, hundreds actually. But I was also part of the homeschooling movement, and the homeschooling movement is very broad. I don't want to paint it with a broad brush stroke and say that everybody's the same. There's small movements inside, but one of these movements was called the Patriarchy Movement, and it is exactly like what it sounds. It's about adherence to the patriarchy. So men are always in power and control over women in the home, in church, and sometimes even in society. Women are born to submit to the male leaders.
And are scriptures invoked for this hierarchy?
Absolutely. It's not specific to a denomination. It's in a lot of different Christian denominations. But yes, they would use Ephesians 5, Genesis 1, some passages in Peter to justify this idea that women are under the control of men. So homeschooling movement, patriarchy movement. Inside of that is something called the Quiverfull Movement, which usually comes along with the patriarchy movement. And it's this idea that you take the scripture from the book of Psalms in the Christian Bible that says, children are like arrows in a mighty man's quiver. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them.
I have to stop you there because we have the same, obviously we have the same verse because it's more or less the same Bible, but right. We take that verse, I say we, the Jehovah's Witness religion takes that verse and actually had a song based on it in a previous songbook called Children, Precious Gifts from God, based on Psalm 127, 3 and 4. And I'm going to trigger a whole bunch of people watching this video now. The words opened with, precious gifts from God our children are, a possession to train and to teach. Like the arrows of a mighty man, we must aim them the target to reach. So they took that verse and focused more on the indoctrination aspect. Mm-hmm. So we are aiming these arrows, therefore we need to inculcate, is the word they used to use, our children to make them worshippers of Jehovah. They didn't so much focus on the verses that came next, where it said something along the lines of, happy is the man who fills his quiver with them, they will not be put to shame, for they will speak with enemies in the city gate. I didn't do too much reading up before we did this interview, but I just found it fascinating that two groups can take the same verse and focus on completely different elements, if that makes sense.
Right, absolutely. So we would focus definitely on the kind of indoctrination side of things, where there was a specific thing being taught, the patriarchy and this very fundamentalist view of Christianity. But yeah, then it would take it a step further and say, blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. So a blessed man will have lots of children. And then they would take this idea that you have as many children as you can, shoot them out into the world like arrows. And they had, I think, maybe 7 different sectors of society to sink those arrows into. So they want children to be infiltrating politics, home, church, schools, media, all kinds of things like that. So it's basically like raising this army of children who are believing in this patriarchal fundamentalist movement and then shooting them out. And I listened to, are you familiar with Vision Forum?
No.
Okay, so they're a very pro-Quiverfull organization. I think that they are now closed because of the sexual abuse scandal. But basically I sat through this lecture on DVD from Vision Forum that said, you know, it was the 200-year plan. So you have 10 kids, those 10 kids have 10 kids, those 10 kids have 10 kids. And in 200 years, you have this astronomical amount of descendants. You shoot them into the world like arrows into these different sectors of society. And then basically you dominate the world through overpopulation. And
which is a very kind of primal sort of way of solving problems. It seems very obvious when you read the verse that that's just the culture that the Bible was written in. It's not necessarily a command from God to have lots of children. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure. So that's more or less the movement that I was in. I was also a stay-at-home daughter, which just kind of took it a step further, that women are supposed to be submissive to their husbands. What do we do with unmarried women? They can't just not submit to anyone. So let's have them submit to their fathers, till they're given away in marriage to a man that they then submit to. So in a nutshell, that was my basic upbringing.
Sure. And obviously when you have a patriarchal hierarchy, and this is like, I should kind of go to pains to point out that that does not describe the Jehovah's Witnesses, at least in terms of an onus on having lots of children. If anything, the reverse was true. In my upbringing, there was a fear that if you had children this close to Armageddon, how would you cope with the Great Tribulation with children in tow? And you have situations where young couples are urged to put pioneering first, or perhaps put other privileges of service in the organization ahead of starting a family and having children, to their detriment even. So it's a different setup in many ways. But I'm interested in knowing how this kind of onus on a patriarchal hierarchy, a patriarchy, what impact that has when it comes to abuse, because it seems like the perfect storm for abusive men to basically act out their fantasies completely unfettered.
Yeah, so, you know, in my research, I'm an abuse victim advocate. I've, taken trainings on abuse, and it's always motivated by power and control. In this patriarchal system, I mean, if you look at a dictionary definition of patriarchy, it's about men having power and control over women. So of course there's going to be abuse there, and of course it's going to be used in, many instances to justify and cover up abuse, those types of things. And there are people in the movement, pastors in the movement who, a wife might come and say, my husband is being physically violent. Well, you need to go back and submit, because that is what's going to change his heart, get him right with God. So, those things happen. There's definitely a hierarchy in value. And so while they say, well, everybody has equal value, just different roles, that's really a lot of BS. And no, there's this hierarchy of value. And so, the man of God is going to be valued more than the woman or the child who was abused by the man of God. And so they're more likely to cover up abuse, in my opinion.
Sure. And just when you're speaking there, I said before there weren't similarities in terms of the number of children. But what you've described could be applied, what you've just described now could be applied to Jehovah's Witnesses, in that, first of all, it's a very male-centric organization. There is the concept repeatedly drilled into women that they should submit to their head in a marriage. Their husband is their spiritual head.
Yes.
And this is a perfect storm for abuse. You also mentioned the fact that if a wife goes to her pastor and says, I've been abused by my husband, the pastor will send them back and say, well, you need to be a better wife. That absolutely happens in Jehovah's Witnesses. And shockingly, we even had a watchtower printed as recently as this month, the December 2018 watchtower, telling women who are in abusive relationships that in some circumstances it might be better if they stick it out, if they endure that situation. The basic reasoning is you're not allowed to get a divorce because the only way out of a marriage is adultery. So basically locked into this marriage for good. And if there's something going wrong, maybe it's your fault for not being a good enough Christian wife. So.
No, absolutely. And what you were saying about adultery being the only out, that I would say that that's true in a lot of cases where they would say adultery is the only way out. But then when that actually happens, it's not always a way out, you know.
Sure. So talk to me about how you got out of this movement, this rather toxic organization.
Right. So when I was a very young child, I kind of bucked against the system. You know, even as young as 4, I could tell like this was not right. And also just being a 4-year-old and trying to develop that independence and not being looked at as rebellious and being put through like a will breaking incident, that really broke my will until I was about 21. And during my late teen years, from 17 to about 21, I actually wrote a blog called Stay at Home Daughter about these beliefs, you know, writing positively. As a woman with some leadership giftings, like that's the way you can kind of use your leadership skills, is by bringing more into the patriarchy. And so I really had bought into it and was teaching it to people. But when a woman briefly visited my church and quickly was like, this is not for me, she invited me to come to a coffee shop where she worked. So I came to visit her, and she introduced me to a man who believed in equality for women from a biblical perspective. And as somebody who had a strong faith in, you know, connection to God and the divine, and, you know, I still personally hold to that view, you know, that was kind of intriguing to me, but honestly scary. And I just told him, like, you know, just leave me alone. I don't want to talk about that. You know, he read my blog and thought it was really weird. But basically, he kept kind of poking at me and asking me these questions. And it was really key that he didn't tell me all the answers. He asked me the questions. And homeschoolers are notoriously good debaters. So I was like, okay, we're going to have a debate. To be a good debater, you need to not only know your point of view, but the other person's point of view. So I could know what his weak points were, knock the legs from underneath him. And yes, I was trying to do that to a man while I was in a patriarchal system, which is ironic. But as I began studying like Christian feminism and how I could actually believe in equality for women and still retain a semblance of faith, and then just looking at the practicality and how is the much more just way to live, the research changed my mind, and we did not have to have that debate. And so when I started changing there, I realized it would change everything. Like I couldn't attend that church anymore. I couldn't be a stay-at-home daughter anymore, where I was being, you know, guided still by my father. And we practiced something called courtship, where parents were heavily involved in the romantic process. I needed to choose my own spouse, you know. So that shift in the equality for women aspect really led me to realize this whole system was broken and that I needed to get out. I started changing ideologically at 21. I started dating, which was very different from courtship. Lots of funny stories there. And I met and married my now husband, Will, which gave me the physical out and continued to explore this new freedom, and then realizing the connections between patriarchy and abuse and the abusive experiences that I'd had.
So I'm just fascinated at the idea of a very clearly intelligent, self-willed, bright young lady being in a situation where she is debating inequality, where she's promoting patriarchal values. So if we were recreating that scenario, what would be your elevator pitch for inequality for women?
Well, I would just say that it was the biblical perspective, and this is what the Bible teaches. It's not inequality. Women just have a different role than men, and their role is to be submissive, not to be leaders. And that this is, I would call it biblical femininity, that God created us to be different. Men and women's brains are different than each other, and so that means we're more prone to being deceived. So we need a man to lead us. So that's the pitch I probably would have given. And
it will resonate with a lot of ex-witnesses and indeed people who are still in that religion, because that's exactly the mindset that you're given.
Right.
Just doesn't belong to women to lead, to be to take the initiative in an organizational setting. And we recently had broadcast on the Leah Remini special the quote from Samuel Hurd talking about the cranial capacity of women being smaller, which when you look into it, it's hilarious, because apparently there is a difference, but women have more grey matter than men or something like that. So it totally evens out. So even scientifically, there's no basis there.
No, you can't take a brain out of a man and a woman and in a lab be able to tell the difference.
Exactly. So I just find it's just so nice to see that through dialogue, through having a conversation with somebody who I'm assuming wasn't pushy, wasn't aggressive or demeaning with you.
Right.
You were able to kind of break out of that mold. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and a lot of it was really the questions. And he gave me some things to think about, but he didn't answer those questions for me. He trusted me enough to find those answers for myself. And that to me was compelling, because I don't know how it is for Jehovah's Witnesses, but for me, I was told that the truth is paramount. And I'd been told what I knew was truth, but when I was confronted with something that I was like, wow, maybe that was wrong, I still felt a loyalty to find truth. And yeah.
Did you refer to it with the definite article, the truth?
Yeah, I mean, we would call it the truth. The Bible.
That's exactly the same with Jehovah.
Even if it's different definitions, which is kind of crazy, because I mean, it's translated from another language.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. So it's just fascinating. I mean, that's the whole purpose of really doing this show, is to compare and contrast. And a lot of what you're saying, again, you could just be describing Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah.
You did mention towards the beginning about the independent fundamentalist Baptist movement and how there's a lot of abuse. I wasn't familiar with that so much, so maybe you could talk me through how we know that's true and what the possible reasons are about the whole setup that makes abuse possible.
Sure. So I would really recommend, it's an article that came out about a week ago in the Star-Telegram, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. There's an amazing reporter named Sarah Smith who did an 8-month investigation of IFB churches. And what she found was over 400 allegations of sexual misconduct, sexual abuse in these churches. She, documents those really well. Has some survivor stories there, and then really goes through about 4 different articles describing the culture of IFB, and linking to some of the police reports and those types of things. And then the next week, actually on this Sunday, another article was released from the Star-Telegram saying that since the first article came out, hundreds more people have disclosed abuse. So, false allegations are very small. About 2 to 8% of sexual abuse allegations are deemed unfounded, not untrue, but unfounded. So like, even if you just take that percentage, which, it's very unlikely for people to lie about sexual abuse, even if you just take that percentage out, I mean, there's still hundreds that are obviously
indeed
true. And so, that I would point to that research there. But really the IFB movement is, you may be familiar with the Southern Baptist Convention, and they're a very interesting thing to look at as well, particularly their beginnings with slavery and all those kinds of things. But independent fundamentalist Baptist churches basically said, we do not want to be a part of like a larger denominational structure. We don't want to have to answer to anyone. So they're very independent. That's in their name. Though they do have this loose networking of churches that, they swap, they swap evangelists, they go to the same Christian camps and same pastors' conferences. So while they do have networks, they're able to say that they're independent. So if an abuse case happens, they're able to use that network to pass the abuser on to another church. But they're also able to say that they're independent, and that really wasn't on them.
When you say pass an abuser on to another church, are we talking about a pastor, or are we talking about an average church attendee?
Both.
Right.
So, an average attendee might move to a different church, and while the pastors may know about it, they may not warn the other congregation. On the other hand, there are cases of missionaries and pastors being moved to a different church, where the previous staff and church knew about it, but they were able to kind of give them a job recommendation. You can't work here anymore, but you can work over here. I don't understand the motive for covering up abuse, full stop. But if we're talking about the picture I'm getting is independent groups that don't answer to any centralized authority, what is the incentive if Joe Blogs says, who's a proven pedophile, says, I'm going to go move to this other church? What's the incentive for them to say, well, we're not going to warn them? It's not like there's like a central authority whose reputation they're looking to protect. It's not like there are kind of numbers necessarily. I'm guessing that they're looking to kind of keep healthy. What's their incentive for covering things up? I'm sure there's differences in each place, but I think the incentive is kind of this idea that there's men of God. And so while a lot of cults have like one centralized leader, some cultic or high control movements have multiple leaders, and it's kind of just this shared ideology. And so they don't want their shared ideology to look bad. So some of the tenets of their belief would be, a lot of the churches used to only read the King James version of the Bible. Some of them are kind of getting away from that now. The patriarchal system, but one of the tenets is this idea that there's a man of God who has God's blessing on them, and basically they can do no wrong. So kind of the church's reputation is staked on these men of God. And they do have some leaders that are very highly respected, I'm trying to think of his first name, Jack Hyles. He was very respected in a lot of IFB churches, and so he had a college and those types of things. And when there were allegations that came out about him, they kind of identified the denomination as a whole based on his reputation, because he was kind of a representative. But again, they claim independence. So it's fascinating. They're able to claim independence when it's convenient for them, but otherwise they often do work as a whole.
Okay. And I'm not expecting there to be total kind of conformity and parallels with JWs, but do you have, is there shunning in IFB groups?
Right. So they will call it church discipline. And, again, each church is different, but what could happen is you could be placed under church discipline where maybe the way for you to be able to receive communion again, or the way for you to be able to be involved in the community, is you have to come before the church and repent. There are cases of people who've had even consensual sexual relationships, which is certainly not allowed in that movement, and have to go in front of the entire church and apologize for those consensual relationships between
in front of the entire church gathering. Wow.
Yeah. So that kind of thing will happen. And if you say no, well, then you're certainly going to be treated differently. So that can happen. Other things can happen where, they do the love bombing and the trying to kind of draw you back in and, kind of shaming you either in front of your family or in front of the church. And so they don't necessarily always just cut you off hard line. Sometimes that happens, but other times the emotional abuse gets so intense that the victim actually has to cut themselves off.
Ah, okay.
Which can be even more confusing sometimes.
Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah, when you're being so humiliated that you actually have to kind of completely get out.
Right.
I can understand that.
Yeah.
So I understand that I mentioned at the beginning that you're a TV producer, and I know that you are in the process of looking for stories of people who have been through movements similar to the Quiverfull Movement. What can you tell me about this project?
Yeah, so I am working as a freelance casting director, and I'm working on a couple of different shows, but the one that we're specifically working on now is one in relation to the idea of child marriage in the US, which currently is legal in 48 of the 50 states. Craziness. There's these
It's astonishing that can be the case in the 21st century, isn't it?
I know. And oftentimes the laws are very sexist. So I believe it's about 75% of these cases are girls to adult men. But it goes even further that in some states, women or girls are allowed to get married younger than boys are allowed to get married as long as they're pregnant. And so it is very sexist. But I was
going to say, you very rarely hear of child marriage where it's a boy. I mean, it's bound to happen somewhere, but I can't conceive of it happening the other way around. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't happen as often. And sometimes the marriage is able to cover up statutory rape. So maybe it's a 14-year-old is impregnated by, a 25-year-old. And in order for him not to go to jail, they quickly have a marriage, which makes it, legal for,
Shocking.
So it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous. There's a higher rate of domestic violence, higher rate of women being in poverty in life later on. And since 2010, there's been over 200,000 cases of child marriage in the US. So, we're working to bring attention to the issue. We're working to try to change some of those laws. So it's 18, no exceptions. If you had, a bad experience or a mistake or whatever unplanned pregnancy, we don't want to compound that with another bad scenario of being married as a child. In some states, you are not allowed to divorce without an adult's help and consent until you are 18. However, you can marry before 18. So you're treated as a runaway if you try to leave. In some states, the man or the adult, usually a man, now becomes your legal guardian, like your parents were. So you're not even emancipated. He's now, the one that you have to be returned back to if you run away until you turn 18. So it's bizarre. It's crazy. It's happening. I did not experience that myself, but certainly in some of the Patriarchy Quiverfull Movement that did happen, and there's some documented cases on Homeschoolers Anonymous website. You can check that out. They've got some stories there. And even people like the Duck Dynasty cast, they've promoted underage marriage, and I think it's Phil Robertson. You can look at the Raw story, and I believe his wife is younger when they got married. So it's actually more popular. But what I would ask is, we're trying to do a show to address this issue. And if anybody has experienced child marriage, whether they're still in it now and are looking to get out, whether they used to be in a child marriage and are already out, If you know of a group that promotes this, either overtly or covertly through maybe arranged marriages, or maybe it's just a part of the culture, I would really love for you to reach out to me, and maybe we can put my contact information under this video.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But we'd love to hear from you as we're developing this show to address this issue in the U.S.
Well, it's a wonderful project, and I'm thrilled to do whatever I can to facilitate its success. And frankly, those figures that you were just reading out are just mind-blowing that can be the case in the 21st century. And in a way, it shows how much progress we still have to make in society, doesn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would just put a plug out to Unchained at Last and the Tahirih Justice Center. They are the two leading organizations dealing with child marriage in the U.S. You can find the statistics and information there. So I'm not just spouting off numbers. Like, you can look at the
Oh, I trust you. I do trust you.
Thank you.
Well, Ashley, it's just been a wonderful conversation. I've learned so much about the Quiverfull movement. It's, again, fascinating to see the parallels with my own background, and I'm sure the viewers will feel the same way. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, and thank you for the good work you're doing. This is so important.
Thank you. So viewers, you have been watching episode 6 of Faith versus Faith. I do hope you've enjoyed it. Please don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more videos. And as always, thank you for watching.